Don't do this. Housekeeper confronts cruel stepmother in front of millionaire in mansion to defend 7-year-old boy in wheelchair. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of the Westwood mansion, its rays filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the Los Angeles skyline. Maria Gonzalez pushed her cleaning cart quietly down the hallway, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the pristine surface. At 26, she had perfected the art of invisibility, a skill essential for survival in the homes of the wealthy. Her petite frame moved with practiced efficiency, dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing the same navy uniform she'd worn for 2 years while working for the Blackwell family. The mansion sprawled across nearly 8,000 square feet, a testament to Richard Blackwell's success in luxury real estate development. Every corner screamed of money, imported Italian furniture, original paintings worth more than most people's homes, and crystal chandeliers that caught the morning light like captured stars. Maria had grown accustomed to the opulence, but it still felt surreal, a far cry from the modest 2-bedroom house in Amarillo, Texas, where she'd grown up helping her mother. Carmen mend clothes for the local community. As she approached the master bedroom wing, Maria's routine was shattered by the sound of raised voices. She froze, her hand gripping the handle of her cleaning supplies. In 2 years of working here, she had perfected the delicate balance of being present but invisible, efficient but unobtrusive. The Blackwells paid well, better than any job she could find in Texas, and she desperately needed every dollar to support her mother's mounting medical bills. "You're absolutely pathetic, Jacob." The voice belonged to Victoria Blackwell, Richard's second wife, her tone dripping with venom. 7 years old, and you can't even drink a glass of water without making a mess." Maria's heart clenched. Little Jacob, she had watched him from afar for months. A quiet boy who navigated the mansion's vast spaces in his wheelchair with a dignity that belied his age. The accident that had taken the use of his legs had happened just before Maria started working here, and she had witnessed firsthand how the family dynamics had shifted around his disability. "I'm sorry." "Victoria," came Jacob's small voice, barely audible through the partially open door. "I didn't mean to. Sorry doesn't clean up water stains on a Persian rug worth more than most people's cars." Victoria's voice rose to a shriek. "Since you can't seem to manage basic motor skills, maybe you don't deserve breakfast today. Think about that while you sit in your room." The sound of a wheelchair rolling away, followed by a door slamming, sent a chill down Maria's spine. She had witnessed emotional cruelty before. Subtle put-downs, dismissive comments, the general air of irritation that seemed to surround Victoria whenever Jacob was present. But this was different. This was deliberate psychological abuse of a child who had already endured more trauma than most adults. Maria's hands trembled as she set down her cleaning supplies. Every instinct told her to walk away, to mind her own business, to remember her place in this household. She thought of her mother lying in that hospital bed in Amarillo, the stack of unpaid medical bills on her kitchen table, the desperate phone calls from collection agencies. This job was her lifeline, her only hope of keeping her family afloat. But as she stood in that hallway, listening to the silence that followed Victoria's cruel words, something deeper stirred within her. She remembered her father's voice, his calloused hands gentle on her shoulders as he spoke about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. "Mija," he used to say in his weathered voice, "sometimes being brave isn't about being strong. Sometimes it's about being right." Taking a deep breath that seemed to echo in the vast space, Maria knocked softly on the master bedroom door. "Mrs. Blackwell, I'm sorry to disturb you, but..." The door swung open with such force that Maria took a step back. Victoria Blackwell stood in the doorway, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair framing a face twisted with annoyance. At 35, she was strikingly beautiful in the way that only money could buy, flawless skin maintained by the best dermatologists, designer workout clothes that cost more than Maria's monthly salary, and jewelry that caught the light with each movement. But her green eyes were cold, calculating, devoid of the warmth that should have existed in a mother's gaze. "What do you want?" Victoria snapped, her manicured fingers gripping the doorframe. "I thought I made it clear that I don't want to be disturbed this morning." Maria's throat felt dry, but she forced herself to speak. "Mrs. Blackwell, I couldn't help but overhear. Jacob is just a little boy. Maybe denying him breakfast isn't—" "Excuse me?" Victoria's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Did you just presume to tell me how to discipline my stepson?" The word stepson dripped with disdain, and Maria felt her resolve strengthen. "I just think that maybe—" "You think?" Victoria stepped fully into the hallway, closing the bedroom door behind her. She was several inches taller than Maria, and she used every inch to her advantage, looking down with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. "You're the help, Maria. You clean toilets and dust furniture. You don't think about anything that happens in this family." Maria's hands clenched at her sides. 2 years of biting her tongue, of watching this woman systematically chip away at a child's self-worth, came flooding back. "With all due respect, Mrs. Blackwell, Jacob is a sweet, intelligent boy who's been through enough. He doesn't deserve to be punished for an accident." Victoria's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Sweet? Intelligent? He's a burden, Maria. A constant reminder of Richard's first marriage, of the perfect little family that couldn't handle a little adversity. That boy will never walk again, never play sports, never be the son Richard dreamed of having. The least he can do is learn some discipline." The cruelty in Victoria's words hit Maria like a physical blow. She thought of Jacob's quiet demeanor, the way he always said please and thank you, how his face lit up with the rare, genuine smile when someone showed him kindness. "He's 7 years old," Maria said, her voice stronger now. "He deserves love, not punishment for existing." Victoria's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I think you've forgotten your place here, Maria. You work for us. You follow our rules. You keep your mouth shut and do your job, or you find yourself another job. Is that clear?" The threat hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Maria knew Victoria wasn't bluffing. She had seen the woman destroy people who crossed her, from contractors who didn't meet her impossible standards to social acquaintances who dared to disagree with her. But as she stood there, facing down this woman who wielded her wealth like a weapon, Maria felt something she hadn't experienced in years: absolute moral clarity. "Crystal clear," Maria said quietly. "But I'm still going to make sure Jacob gets breakfast." The sound of the front door opening echoed through the mansion's grand foyer, followed by the familiar rhythm of expensive Italian leather shoes on marble. Richard Blackwell's voice called out from below, deep and authoritative. "Victoria, I'm back early." The Denver deal closed faster than expected. Victoria's face went pale, her eyes darting between Maria and the direction of her husband's voice. In that moment, Maria saw something she had never witnessed before. Victoria Blackwell was afraid. "Richard doesn't need to know about this conversation," Victoria hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you understand me?" But Maria was already walking away, her steps purposeful as she headed toward Jacob's room. Behind her, she could hear Victoria's sharp intake of breath, the frantic clicking of heels as she hurried toward the staircase to intercept her husband. The die was cast. Maria Gonzalez, daughter of a seamstress from rural Texas, had just declared war on one of Los Angeles's most powerful women. As she knocked gently on Jacob's door, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and determination, she had no idea that her act of courage would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just her own life, but the lives of everyone in the Blackwell mansion. Through the door, she heard Jacob's small voice, "Come in." Maria opened the door to find the boy sitting by his window, staring out at the sprawling city below, with an expression far too mature for his 7 years. This was where it would begin. not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but with a simple act of kindness toward a child who desperately needed someone to see his worth. The kitchen of the Blackwell mansion was a masterpiece of modern design. Granite countertops that gleamed under pendant lighting, stainless steel appliances that belonged in a five-star restaurant, and a center island large enough to prepare meals for a small army. Maria moved quietly through the space, preparing a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, while her mind raced with the implications of what had just transpired upstairs. She could hear Richard's voice echoing from the foyer, growing closer as he made his way through the house. At 42, Richard Blackwell commanded attention wherever he went. Standing 6'2" with salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes, he had built his real estate empire through a combination of shrewd business instincts and an intimidating presence that could close million-dollar deals with a handshake. Maria had always found him polite but distant, a man who existed in a world so far removed from hers that they might as well have been different species. "Maria?" Jacob's voice was barely above a whisper as she entered his room carrying a breakfast tray. The boy sat hunched in his wheelchair, his dark hair falling across his forehead as he stared at his hands. He had his father's blue eyes and delicate features that hinted at the handsome man he would one day become. But there was a sadness in his expression that no 7-year-old should carry. "I brought you some breakfast." "Sweetheart," Maria said gently, setting the tray on the desk beside his art supplies. The room was a study in contradictions, expensive furniture and toys that remained largely untouched, while Jacob's true passion was evident in the sketches scattered across every surface. His drawings were remarkable for a child his age, detailed portraits of birds, landscapes viewed from his window, and abstract expressions of emotion that spoke to a depth of understanding far beyond his years. "Victoria said I couldn't have breakfast," Jacob murmured, not looking up from his hands. Maria knelt beside his wheelchair, bringing herself to his eye level. "Well, Victoria isn't here right now, and I think growing boys need to eat. Besides, I made your favorite, scrambled eggs with cheese." A small smile tugged at the corner of Jacob's mouth, the first genuine expression of happiness Maria had seen from him in weeks. "You remembered?" "Of course I remembered." Maria watched as he began to eat, noting how he held his fork with the same careful precision he used when drawing. "Jacob, can I ask you something?" The boy nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "How often does Victoria get upset with you like that?" Jacob's hand paused halfway to his mouth, his eyes darting toward the door, as if Victoria might materialize at any moment. "She says I'm clumsy because of my legs, that I make too much work for everyone." The casual way he repeated Victoria's cruel words, as if they were simple facts rather than psychological abuse, made Maria's chest tighten with anger. "Jacob, listen to me very carefully. You are not clumsy. You are not a burden. What happened to your legs doesn't make you less than anyone else. Do you understand?" Jacob looked at her with an expression of such hope and confusion that it nearly broke her heart. "But Victoria says—" "Victoria is wrong." Maria's voice was firm but gentle. "Sometimes adults say things that aren't true, especially when they're angry or frustrated about other things in their lives. That doesn't make their words right." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made them both freeze. Maria quickly stood, positioning herself between Jacob and the door as Richard Blackwell's voice grew closer. "Victoria, where did you say the quarterly reports were?" "In your study, darling," came Victoria's voice, sweet as honey, now that her husband was home. "How was Denver? Did the Morrison project close successfully?" Maria listened to their conversation as it faded down the hallway, noting the complete transformation in Victoria's tone. Gone was the venom, replaced by the cultured accent and charming demeanor that had won Richard's heart 3 years earlier. It was a masterful performance, one that Maria was only now beginning to recognize for what it truly was. Over the following days, Maria found herself observing the household dynamics with new eyes. She began to notice patterns that had previously escaped her attention, how Victoria's mood shifted dramatically depending on who was present, how Jacob seemed to shrink into himself whenever his stepmother entered a room, how Richard appeared to exist in a bubble of willful ignorance about the tension that permeated his home. The revelation came on a Thursday morning while Maria was dusting the family room. She discovered one of Jacob's sketchbooks, wedged between couch cushions, apparently dropped and forgotten. As she flipped through the pages, her breath caught in her throat. The drawings told a story that no 7-year-old should have to illustrate. Dark, heavy lines depicting a woman with sharp features towering over a small figure in a wheelchair. Scenes of isolation and sadness that spoke to months of emotional torment. One drawing in particular made Maria's hands tremble. It showed a boy in a wheelchair sitting alone at a large table while shadowy figures ate together in the background. The title, written in Jacob's careful handwriting, read, "When I'm Bad." Those are quite remarkable, aren't they? Maria spun around, clutching the sketchbook to her chest. Richard Blackwell stood in the doorway, still wearing his business suit from a morning meeting. His expression was unreadable as he stepped into the room. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm sorry. I found this between the cushions, and I was just looking at my son's artwork," Richard finished, his voice carrying an edge she had never heard before. "May I see it?" With trembling hands, Maria passed him the sketchbook. She watched his face as he flipped through the pages, noting how his jaw tightened with each drawing, how his knuckles whitened as he gripped the book. "How long has he been drawing like this?" Richard's voice was barely controlled. I don't know, sir. I just found it today." Richard closed the sketchbook with deliberate care, his blue eyes meeting Maria's for the first time in 2 years of employment. "Maria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you noticed anything unusual about how Jacob is treated when I'm not here?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that could change everything. Maria thought of her mother's medical bills, of the job security she desperately needed, of Victoria's threats. But she also thought of Jacob's sad eyes and the weight of secrets that no child should have to carry. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "I have." Richard's expression hardened, and for the first time Maria caught a glimpse of the steel that had built his business empire. "Tell me everything." For the next 20 minutes, Maria recounted what she had witnessed: the verbal abuse, the punishment, the systematic undermining of Jacob's self-worth. Richard listened without interruption, his face growing paler with each revelation. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" he asked when she finished. Maria looked down at her hands. "I tried to stay invisible, Mr. Blackwell. I needed this job, and I thought maybe I was seeing things wrong, or that it wasn't my place to interfere." "And what changed?" Maria thought of that morning in the hallway, of Victoria's cruel words, and Jacob's resigned acceptance of them. "I realized that some things are more important than keeping quiet. That little boy upstairs deserves someone in his corner." Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the sprawling grounds of his estate. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Maria, I'm going to ask something of you that goes far beyond your job description. I need you to be my eyes and ears in this house. I travel frequently for business, and it's clear that I've been absent in ways that matter. Will you help me?" The request was unprecedented. A wealthy businessman asking his housekeeper to spy on his own wife. Maria knew she was being pulled into something dangerous, something that could destroy her life if it went wrong. But as she thought of Jacob eating breakfast alone in his room, of the drawings that revealed a child's hidden pain, she knew there was only one answer she could give. "Yes, sir. I'll help you." Richard nodded, a look of grim determination settling over his features. "And Maria, thank you for standing up for my son when I failed to." As he left the room, sketchbook in hand, Maria sank onto the couch with shaking legs. She had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. Whatever came next, she was now an active participant in the unraveling of the Blackwell family's carefully constructed facade. Upstairs, Jacob's laughter echoed through the hallway as he played with toy cars, blissfully unaware that his drawings had just set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. 3 weeks had passed since Richard's request, and Maria found herself living in a state of constant vigilance. Every interaction between Victoria and Jacob became evidence to catalogue. Every cruel word or dismissive gesture, another piece of a puzzle that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. She had begun keeping a small notebook hidden in her cleaning supplies, documenting dates, times, and incidents. With the methodical precision her father had taught her when keeping track of his construction jobs, the mansion felt different, now charged with an undercurrent of tension that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Richard had become more present, cancelling business trips and working from his home office more frequently. His interactions with Victoria remained cordial on the surface, but Maria noticed the way his eyes followed his wife when she thought he wasn't looking, the careful attention he paid to her words during dinner conversations. Victoria, for her part, had grown increasingly paranoid. She had always been controlling, but now her need to micromanage every aspect of the household had reached obsessive levels. She questioned Maria's cleaning schedule, demanded detailed reports of Jacob's daily activities, and had even suggested hiring additional staff to ensure proper supervision. "I don't like the way things have been running lately," Victoria announced during one of her impromptu meetings in the kitchen. She stood with her arms crossed, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against her designer blazer. "There's been a general lack of accountability around here." Maria continued wiping down the granite countertops, keeping her expression neutral. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Blackwell. Is there something specific I can improve?" Victoria's green eyes narrowed. "Well, for starters, I've noticed that some of my jewelry has been misplaced recently. My diamond tennis bracelet, the one Richard gave me for our anniversary, seems to have disappeared from my jewelry box." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Maria's hand stilled on the counter as she processed the implication. "I'm very sorry to hear about your bracelet, ma'am. I always clean around your jewelry very carefully. I never remove anything from its place." Victoria's tone dripped with skepticism. "How interesting." "Because I distinctly remember placing it in my jewelry box last Tuesday, and when I went to wear it to lunch with the Hendersons yesterday, it was gone." Maria turned to face Victoria fully, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Are you suggesting that I took your bracelet?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Victoria replied with false sweetness. "I'm simply noting a concerning coincidence. Expensive items going missing, new relationships forming in this household. It makes one wonder about loyalties and trust." The kitchen door swung open, interrupting their tense exchange. Jacob rolled in, his face bright with excitement as he clutched a new drawing. "Maria, look what I made." He held up a detailed sketch of a bird in flight, wings spread against a backdrop of clouds. "It's a red-tailed hawk. I saw it outside my window this morning." Maria's face softened as she knelt to examine his artwork. "Jacob, this is incredible. Look at the detail in the feathers. You're getting so good at shading." "I've been practicing like you showed me," Jacob beamed, his eyes shining with pride. "Do you think Dad would like it?" "Indeed, I think your father would be very proud," Maria said, meaning every word. The boy's artistic talent continued to amaze her. What had started as simple sketches had evolved into sophisticated drawings that captured both technical skill and emotional depth. Victoria cleared her throat loudly. "Jacob, what have I told you about interrupting adult conversations?" The light in Jacob's eyes dimmed instantly. "I'm sorry, Victoria. I just wanted to show Maria my drawing." "Maria is here to work, not to play art teacher," Victoria snapped. "Now go to your room and let the adults finish their discussion." Jacob's shoulders slumped as he turned his wheelchair toward the door. Maria watched him go, her heart aching at the transformation from joy to dejection in mere seconds. That's exactly what I'm talking about, Victoria said once Jacob was out of earshot. Inappropriate relationships, blurred boundaries. It's unprofessional and concerning. Maria bit back her first 3 responses, all of which would have resulted in immediate termination. Instead, she focused on Richard's request. Be his eyes and ears. Document everything. I understand your concerns. Mrs. Blackwell, I'll make sure to maintain appropriate professional boundaries. Victoria studied her for a long moment, as if trying to read her thoughts. See that you do. And Maria, if my bracelet doesn't turn up soon, I'll have no choice but to contact the police. Identity theft and burglary are serious crimes in California. That evening, Maria found herself in Richard's study at his request. The room was a monument to masculine sophistication, dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and awards from various real estate associations. Richard sat behind his massive desk, looking older than his 42 years, as he reviewed the notes Maria had been keeping. The bracelet accusation is escalating things, he said finally, setting down her notebook. Victoria's never been this direct before. Maria shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Mr. Blackwell, I want you to know that I would never... Maria. Richard's voice was firm but kind. I know you didn't take anything. Victoria's pattern is becoming clear. Isolate Jacob from anyone who shows him kindness. Discredit anyone who might challenge her authority. The question is, what's her endgame? Before Maria could respond, the intercom on Richard's desk buzzed. His assistant's voice crackled through the speaker. Mr. Blackwell, I have Detective Morrison from LAPD on line 2. He says it's regarding a theft report. Richard and Maria locked eyes, both understanding the implications immediately. Victoria had followed through on her threat. Put him through, Richard said, pressing the speakerphone button. Detective Morrison, this is Richard Blackwell. Mr. Blackwell, thank you for taking my call. We received a theft report from your wife regarding some missing jewelry. I was hoping to schedule a time to come by and take statements from your household staff. Maria felt the walls closing in around her. A police investigation would mean scrutiny, background checks, questions that could expose the complex web of surveillance and counter-surveillance that the Blackwell household had become. Of course, Detective, Richard replied smoothly. However, I should mention that we recently installed a comprehensive security system throughout the house. Would video evidence be helpful in your investigation? The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Video evidence? Your wife didn't mention any cameras when she filed the report. Richard's eyes never left Maria's face as he continued. Oh yes, we have coverage of every common area in the house. Bedrooms and bathrooms excluded for privacy, of course, but hallways, kitchen, living areas, everything is recorded in high definition with timestamp. Maria could practically hear Detective Morrison's interest intensify. That would be extremely helpful, Mr. Blackwell. When was this system installed? About 3 weeks ago, Richard replied, his voice carrying just a hint of satisfaction. Right around the time we began having concerns about household security. After scheduling an appointment for the following day, Richard ended the call and leaned back in his chair. Maria stared at him with a mixture of admiration and confusion. There really are cameras? She asked. Richard's smile was grim. Oh, yes. Victoria doesn't know about them yet, but she's about to find out. The question is, what exactly will those cameras reveal? As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of heels clicking rapidly down the hallway announced Victoria's approach. She appeared in the doorway moments later, her face flushed with what looked like panic. Richard, darling, we need to talk. I just received a very strange call from someone claiming to be with the police department, asking about our security system. I told them we don't have any cameras, but they seem to think we do have cameras, Victoria, Richard interrupted calmly. I had them installed 3 weeks ago. I thought I mentioned it. Victoria's face went white. Cameras? Where? Moi system. Throughout the common areas of the house. For security purposes. Richard's tone remained conversational, but Maria could see the steel beneath the surface. In fact, Detective Morrison will be here tomorrow to review the footage related to your theft report. The transformation in Victoria was immediate and startling. The confident, controlling woman who had dominated the household for 3 years suddenly looked small and trapped. Her eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape route. That is, perhaps I was mistaken about the bracelet. Maybe I simply misplaced it. There's no need to involve the police over a simple misunderstanding. But you already involved them, Richard pointed out reasonably. The report has been filed. Detective Morrison seemed quite eager to review our security footage. Victoria's breathing became shallow, her hands trembling as she gripped the doorframe. Richard, surely you can call this off. Tell them it was all a mistake. I could, Richard agreed. But then I'd miss the opportunity to see what else our cameras might have captured over the past 3 weeks. Don't you think that would be fascinating? The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Victoria understood exactly what Richard was implying, that the cameras had recorded far more than a missing bracelet. Her treatment of Jacob, her private phone calls, her afternoon meetings when Richard was away on business. I think I should go lie down, Victoria whispered, backing away from the doorway. I have a terrible headache. After she left, Richard turned to Maria with an expression that mixed triumph with sadness. And now we wait to see what secrets our home has been keeping. Maria realized that the game had fundamentally changed. What had started as her simple act of standing up for Jacob had evolved into something much larger and more dangerous. The cameras would reveal the truth, but they would also expose just how deep the deception in the Blackwell household truly ran. The detective's visit was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, but by noon, the entire atmosphere of the Blackwell mansion had shifted into something resembling a war zone. Victoria had barely emerged from the master bedroom since her confrontation with Richard the night before, and when she did appear, it was with the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't slept. Maria noticed how her hands shook as she gripped her coffee cup, how she kept glancing toward the corners of rooms as if just now noticing the small black cameras that had been silently recording for weeks. Richard, meanwhile, had transformed into the calculated businessman who had built an empire through strategic thinking and careful timing. He spent the morning in his study, reviewing security footage on his laptop with the focused intensity of a prosecutor building a case. Maria caught glimpses of the screen as she brought him coffee, images of hallways, the kitchen, the family room where so many of their documented incidents had taken place. "Maria!" Richard called as she was about to leave his study. "Before Detective Morrison arrives, there's something you need to see." He turned his laptop toward her, and Maria found herself watching security footage from the previous Tuesday, the day Victoria claimed her bracelet had gone missing. The timestamp showed 2:47 p.m., and the camera angle captured Victoria's jewelry box clearly. On screen, Victoria herself could be seen removing the diamond tennis bracelet and placing it in a small, velvet pouch before tucking it into her purse. She staged the theft, Maria breathed, the implications hitting her like a physical blow. "It gets worse," Richard said grimly, fast-forwarding the footage. "Watch this." The timestamp jumped to later that same evening. The camera showed Victoria entering Maria's small quarters on the ground floor, a space Maria had assumed was private. Victoria moved quickly and purposefully, hiding the velvet pouch containing the bracelet behind a loose baseboard near Maria's dresser. "She planted it in my room," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. "She was going to let me be arrested." Richard's expression was stone cold. "The question is why? What drove her to this level of desperation?" Before Maria could respond, the intercom buzzed. "Mr. Blackwell, your sister-in-law has arrived. Should I send her up?" Richard frowned. "My sister-in-law? I wasn't expecting—" He paused, understanding dawning on his face. "Send her up." Moments later, A woman appeared in the doorway who bore a striking resemblance to Richard, but carried herself with an entirely different energy. Catherine Blackwell Hayes was 45, with greying brown hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a simple but expensive traveling outfit, and her face showed the weariness of someone who had just stepped off a long, international flight. "Richard," she said, stepping into the study with the confidence of someone who belonged there. "I apologize for the surprise visit, but I caught the first flight out of London when I got your message about Jacob." Maria started to excuse herself, but Catherine's attention turned to her immediately. "And you must be Maria. Jacob's mentioned you in his letters." "His letters?" Richard looked confused. Catherine smiled, reaching into her purse to pull out a small stack of envelopes. "My nephew has been corresponding with me for the past 6 months. Didn't you know?" She handed one of the letters to Richard. "His artwork is remarkable, but more importantly, his words paint a very concerning picture of life in this house." Richard opened the letter, his face growing increasingly grim as he read. Maria could see Jacob's careful handwriting, accompanied by one of his detailed drawings, this one showing a small figure in a wheelchair, isolated in a corner, while larger figures loomed nearby. "He wrote to you about Victoria," Richard said, his voice flat, "among other things." Catherine's tone was carefully neutral, but Maria could see the steel beneath her polite exterior. "Richard, we need to talk privately." Richard glanced at Maria, then back at his sister. "Actually, Catherine, Maria is very much a part of this conversation. She's been documenting issues we've been having." Catherine raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Very well. In that case, Maria, I should thank you. Jacob's letters speak very highly of your kindness to him. It seems you've been the one bright spot in what sounds like a very difficult situation." "I just try to treat him with respect," Maria said quietly. "He's a special boy." "He is indeed." Catherine settled into one of the leather chairs facing Richard's desk. "Which is why I'm so concerned about what he's been telling me. Richard, when was the last time you really observed Jacob's interactions with Victoria?" Richard's jaw tightened. "I've been reviewing that situation. We've recently installed security cameras." "Cameras?" Catherine's voice sharpened. "Richard, what exactly has been happening in this house?" For the next 30 minutes, Richard and Maria took turns explaining the events of the past few weeks. The breakfast incident, the increasing documentation of abuse, the staged theft, and now the impending police investigation. Catherine listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each revelation. "My God, Richard," she said when they finished. How long has this been going on?" "I think longer than I want to admit," Richard replied, his voice heavy with guilt. "I've been traveling so much, building the business. I thought Victoria was adjusting well to having Jacob full-time, especially after the accident. I thought—" "You thought what?" "That a woman who married you 6 months after your first wife died was suddenly going to become a loving stepmother to a disabled child." Catherine's words were harsh but not unkind. "Richard, I tried to warn you about Victoria 3 years ago." The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted their conversation. Victoria appeared in the doorway, and the transformation in her appearance was shocking. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup streaked, and she was wearing a wrinkled designer dress that looked like she had slept in it. "Catherine," she said, her voice artificially bright. "What a surprise! I didn't know you were visiting." "Hello, Victoria." Catherine's tone was polite but cold. "I was just discussing Jacob's education with Richard. It seems my nephew has quite a talent for writing." Victoria's eyes darted nervously between the three of them. "Writing? Jacob barely speaks." "I don't know what you mean." Catherine held up one of Jacob's letters. "He's been corresponding with me for months. Quite articulate for a 7-year-old, don't you think?" The colour drained from Victoria's face. I wasn't aware he was writing letters." "No, I imagine you weren't." Catherine's voice carried a dangerous edge. "There are many things you seem unaware of when it comes to that child. The tension in the room was suffocating. Maria could see Victoria's hands trembling as she gripped the doorframe, could practically hear the wheels turning in her head as she tried to calculate how much damage Jacob's letters might have caused. "Well," Victoria said with forced cheerfulness, "I should let you continue your family discussion." "Richard, darling," Detective Morrison called. "He's running a bit late, but should be here within the hour." She disappeared as quickly as she had arrived, leaving the three of them in heavy silence. "She's panicking," Catherine observed. "Good. Maybe now we can get some truth about what's been happening to Jacob." Richard stood and walked to the window, staring out at the grounds where Jacob could be seen in his wheelchair, drawing in a sketchbook while sitting beneath a large oak tree. "Catherine, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you think I'm a terrible father?" The question hung in the air like a confession. Catherine joined her brother at the window, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "I think you're a father who got overwhelmed by grief and made some poor choices," she said softly. "But I also think it's not too late to fix this. That little boy out there still believes in you, Richard. His letters talk about wanting to make you proud, about hoping you'll spend more time with him." Maria watched the siblings stand together, both focused on the small figure outside. Jacob looked so peaceful in that moment, absorbed in his art, unaware of the storm brewing around him. "The detective will be here soon," Richard said finally. "And then we'll know exactly what those cameras captured. Whatever they show," Catherine said firmly, "Jacob's welfare comes first. That boy has been through enough trauma for one lifetime." As if sensing their attention, Jacob looked up from his drawing and waved at the window. All three adults waved back, and Maria felt a surge of hope. For the first time since she had started working for the Blackwells, Jacob had allies, real allies who were willing to fight for his well-being. But Victoria wasn't finished yet. Maria had learned enough about the woman over the past 2 years to know that cornered animals were often the most dangerous. Whatever came next, she had the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The intercom buzzed again. "Mr. Blackwell." "Detective Morrison has arrived." Richard straightened his shoulders, transforming back into the confident businessman who commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals. "Send him up. It's time for the truth." Detective James Morrison was not what Maria had expected. A tall, lean man in his mid-40s, with prematurely grey hair and observant brown eyes, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen enough human nature to rarely be surprised. His rumpled sport coat and slightly worn shoes suggested a working-class background, and Maria found herself oddly comforted by his presence. He seemed like someone who would care more about truth than appearances. "Mr. Blackwell, thank you for accommodating this visit," Detective Morrison said as he settled into the chair Catherine had vacated. His eyes took in the opulent study with professional interest, but no obvious judgment. "I understand there's been some confusion about the theft report filed by your wife." "Indeed there has been," Richard replied, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man choosing his words carefully. "Detective, before we proceed, I should mention that we have comprehensive security footage that covers the time frame in question." Detective Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Your wife didn't mention any security system when she filed the report." "The cameras were recently installed," Richard explained, "for security purposes, given the value of items in our home. I believe the footage will provide clarity regarding the missing bracelet." "I'd very much like to see that footage," the detective said, pulling out a small notebook. "But first, I'd like to speak with your staff members individually." "Standard procedure in theft investigations." Maria felt her stomach clench. Despite knowing she was innocent, the formal police investigation felt overwhelming. She thought of her mother back in Amarillo, of how a criminal record, even false charges, could destroy any chance she had of building a better life. "Of course," Richard said. "Maria here is our primary housekeeper." She's the one Mrs. Blackwell believed might have had access to the jewelry in question. Detective Morrison turned his attention to Maria, his expression neutral but not unkind. Ms. Gonzalez. Maria Gonzalez. Ms. Gonzalez, how long have you worked for the Blackwell family? 2 years, sir. Since August of 2022. And in that time, have you ever had any issues with missing items or accusations of theft? Maria shook her head. No, sir, never. I've always been very careful with the family's belongings. Detective Morrison made a note. Tell me about Tuesday, the day Mrs. Blackwell claims the bracelet went missing. What was your routine that day? Maria recounted her day in detail, cleaning schedules, interactions with family members, her movements throughout the house. The detective listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification, but showing no sign of whether he believed her account. Ms. Gonzalez, has there been any tension between you and Mrs. Blackwell recently? Any conflicts or disagreements? The question hit at the heart of everything that had been building over the past weeks. Maria glanced at Richard, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. There have been philosophical differences about childcare, Maria said carefully. I believe children should be treated with kindness and patience. Mrs. Blackwell has different views. Detective Morrison's pen paused over his notebook. Can you elaborate on these philosophical differences? Before Maria could answer, Victoria's voice rang out from the hallway. Detective Morrison, I'm so sorry I wasn't here to greet you personally. I was on an important call with my attorney. She swept into the room, wearing a fresh outfit and perfect makeup, every trace of her earlier distress carefully concealed. The transformation was so complete that Maria wondered if she had imagined the disheveled woman from an hour earlier. Mrs. Blackwell, Detective Morrison stood to shake her hand. I was just beginning my investigation into your theft report. Oh yes, the bracelet. Victoria's laugh was light and musical. Actually, Detective, I may have been somewhat hasty in filing that report. You know how emotional one can become when sentimental jewelry goes missing. Detective Morrison's expression didn't change, but Maria caught the slight sharpening of his attention. Are you saying you'd like to withdraw the complaint? Well, not exactly withdraw it, Victoria said, settling gracefully into a chair. But perhaps we could handle this matter privately within the family. I'd hate for poor Maria to suffer any unnecessary stress over what might be a simple misunderstanding. The calculated kindness in Victoria's voice made Maria's skin crawl. She was watching a master manipulator at work, trying to control the narrative before the security footage could be reviewed. Mrs. Blackwell, Detective Morrison said, his tone professional but firm. Once a theft report has been filed, we have an obligation to investigate thoroughly. However, I do appreciate your concern for your employees' well-being. Richard leaned forward in his chair. Detective, perhaps we should review that security footage now. I think it will clarify the situation for everyone involved. Victoria's face went pale, despite her makeup. Richard, darling, surely that's not necessary if I'm willing to drop the charges. The footage exists, Mrs. Blackwell, Detective Morrison interrupted gently. At this point, it's evidence in an ongoing investigation. I'm obligated to review it. Richard turned his laptop toward the detective and began playing the relevant clips. Maria watched Victoria's face as the footage rolled, first showing Victoria removing the bracelet from her jewelry box, then later planting it in Maria's room. The transformation from confident manipulation to trapped desperation was almost pitiable. Detective Morrison watched in silence, his expression giving nothing away. When the footage ended, he closed his notebook and looked directly at Victoria. Mrs. Blackwell, filing a false police report is a serious offense in California. So is evidence tampering and attempted fraud. Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. Detective, you don't understand. There are circumstances, family dynamics that are complicated. I was trying to protect my family from what exactly? Catherine's voice cut through Victoria's stammering from the doorway. She had been listening from the hallway, and her expression was ice cold. Protect them from what, Victoria? The room fell silent, except for the sound of Victoria's labored breathing. Maria realized they had reached the point of no return. All the carefully constructed lies and manipulations were crumbling in real time. "I think," Detective Morrison said finally, "we need to have a longer conversation, Mrs. Blackwell, and I think it would be best if we had that conversation at the station." "Am I under arrest?" Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. "Not at this moment. But I am asking you to come in voluntarily to answer some questions about this incident and to formally retract your theft accusation against Ms. Gonzalez." Victoria looked around the room desperately, her eyes finally landing on Richard. "Darling, surely you can't want this. Think about the scandal, the business implications." "I'm thinking about my son," Richard said quietly, "and about the woman who's been protecting him while I was too blind to see what was happening." The defeat in Victoria's shoulders was complete. She gathered her purse with shaking hands and stood to follow Detective Morrison. At the doorway, she turned back one final time. "This isn't over," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of desperation and venom. "You have no idea what you're destroying." After they left, the study fell into heavy silence. Catherine was the first to speak. "Richard, there's something else we need to discuss. Something Jacob told me about his biological mother." Richard's head snapped up. "Sarah, Catherine, Sarah died in that car accident 3 years ago. Jacob knows that. That's what Jacob was told," Catherine said carefully. "But in his letters, he mentions dreams about his mother, dreams where she's calling for him. Richard, what if Sarah didn't die in that accident?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Maria felt the ground shifting beneath them once again. Just when she thought they had reached the bottom of the Blackwell family's secrets, another layer was being peeled away. "That's impossible," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I identified the body myself. I planned her funeral." "Did you?" Catherine's voice was gentle but insistent. "Or did Victoria handle those arrangements while you were grieving? Richard, what if everything we think we know about Sarah's death is a lie?" As if summoned by their conversation, Jacob's voice could be heard in the hallway, talking excitedly to someone about his latest drawing. The sound of approaching footsteps meant their private conversation was about to be interrupted. But Maria could see that Catherine's questions had shaken Richard to his core. Whatever secrets Victoria had been keeping, whatever lies had been constructed around Jacob's past, they were all about to come tumbling down. And Maria realized that her simple act of standing up for a child had unleashed forces that would reshape not just the Blackwell family, but potentially bring back someone they all thought was lost forever. The door opened, and Jacob rolled in, his face bright with excitement, completely unaware that his entire world was about to change once again. Jacob's excitement filled the room like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Aunt Catherine, Maria, look what I drew!" He held up his latest creation, a detailed sketch of the mansion's garden with a figure in the distance that seemed to be waving. "I saw someone by the roses this morning, but when I called out, they were gone." The innocence in his voice contrasted sharply with the heavy implications of Catherine's revelation. Maria watched Richard's face drain of color as he stared at his son's drawing, the figure rendered with the careful detail that had become Jacob's signature. "Jacob," Catherine said gently, kneeling beside his wheelchair, "can you tell me more about this person you saw? What did they look like?" "She had long dark hair, like in the pictures Dad keeps in his desk," Jacob said, his blue eyes wide with the earnestness that only children possess. "She was too far away to see her face, but she moved like she knew the garden, like she'd been there before." Richard's hands were trembling as he opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small framed photograph. It showed a beautiful woman with Jacob's dark hair and gentle eyes, her arms wrapped around a much younger Jacob who was standing on his own 2 legs. The resemblance between the woman in the photo and Jacob's drawing was unmistakable. "Sarah," Richard whispered, his voice breaking on the name. Maria had heard fragments of The story over her 2 years with the family, Richard's first wife, Jacob's mother, who had supposedly died in a car accident when Jacob was 4. The tragedy had occurred just 6 months before Maria started working for the family, and it was a subject that was rarely discussed. Victoria had made sure of that. "Richard," Catherine said urgently, "we need to find out the truth. If Sarah is alive, if she's been kept away from Jacob all this time, that's impossible." Richard stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "I saw the accident report. I identified—" He stopped, his face going even paler. "Victoria handled the arrangements. She said I was too distraught, that she would take care of everything." The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Maria found herself thinking back to Victoria's earlier words. "You have no idea what you're destroying." What if Victoria hadn't been referring to her marriage or social standing? What if she had been protecting a much darker secret? "Dad?" Jacob's voice was small and confused. "Why do you look so scared? Did I do something wrong with my drawing?" Richard immediately knelt beside his son's wheelchair, his businessman's composure cracking to reveal raw parental love and pain. "Nobody. Your drawing is perfect. It's beautiful. I need to make some phone calls." Catherine stood, her face set with determination. "Richard, I'm going to search the garden where Jacob saw this woman. Maria, would you stay with Jacob?" "Of course," Maria replied, though her mind was racing with questions and possibilities that seemed too enormous to contemplate. After Catherine left, Richard began making a series of phone calls to lawyers, to private investigators, to contacts in the police department. Maria could hear fragments of urgent conversations about exhuming bodies, investigating falsified death certificates, and tracking financial records. Each call seemed to confirm that Victoria's web of deception ran far deeper than anyone had imagined. "Maria," Jacob said quietly while his father was on the phone, "do you think my mom might still be alive?" The question hit Maria like a physical blow. She looked into Jacob's eyes, so hopeful, so vulnerable, and realized that this 7-year-old had been carrying the weight of impossible dreams for years. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said honestly, "but I promise you this, we're going to find out the truth. And whatever that truth is, you're going to be surrounded by people who love you." Jacob nodded solemnly, then returned to his drawing with the focused intensity that Maria had come to recognize as his way of processing complex emotions. She watched him add details to the garden scene, his small hands moving with practiced skill as he captured not just visual reality, but emotional truth. Catherine returned an hour later, her face flushed from exertion and excitement. In her hands, she carried a small object that made Richard drop his phone mid-conversation. "I found this caught on a rose bush," she said, holding up a delicate silver bracelet. "Richard, isn't this—" "Sarah's charm bracelet," Richard finished, his voice barely audible. "I gave it to her on our first anniversary. She never took it off." The bracelet caught the afternoon light, each small charm telling a story of a marriage and love that had supposedly ended in tragedy 3 years earlier. But if Sarah was dead, how had her bracelet ended up in the garden that morning? "There's more," Catherine continued. "I found footprints in the soft soil near the roses. Small feet, women's shoes. And Richard, the gardener, said he's been finding flowers arranged in patterns he didn't create. Someone has been visiting this garden regularly." Jacob looked up from his drawing, his eyes wide with an emotion Maria couldn't quite identify. "The flower lady?" he said simply. "I've seen her before, but Victoria always said I was making it up. She said it was just my imagination because I missed Mom." The cruelty of that lie, telling a grieving child that his hope for his mother's return was just fantasy, made Maria's anger toward Victoria burn even hotter. How many nights had Jacob lain awake, wondering if he was losing his mind? How many times had he doubted his own perceptions because Victoria had systematically gaslit him? Richard's phone rang, interrupting the charged silence. He answered with a sharp, "Blackwell," then listened for several minutes, his expression growing increasingly grim. "That was my private investigator," he said when he hung up. The body that was buried under Sarah's name. It was never properly identified. Victoria paid the funeral home extra for a closed casket service, claiming the accident injuries were too severe. But there was no autopsy, no dental records verification, nothing. Catherine sank into a chair, the full magnitude of Victoria's deception becoming clear. My God, Richard. She faked Sarah's death, but why? What did she gain from keeping Sarah away from Jacob? Control, Maria said quietly, the pieces finally clicking into place. Complete control over Jacob and Richard. If Sarah was alive, she would have had parental rights. She could have challenged Victoria's authority, could have exposed the abuse. But where has Sarah been all this time? Richard asked, his voice hollow with grief and guilt. If she's alive, why hasn't she tried to contact us? Why hasn't she tried to get Jacob back? The answer came not from any of the adults, but from Jacob himself. He had been listening to their conversation with the intense focus that children bring to discussions that will change their world. Because Victoria told her we didn't want her anymore, he said with the matter-of-fact tone that only children use for devastating truths. In my dreams, Mom is always crying and saying she's sorry she can't come home. She says someone won't let her. The room fell silent as the full horror of Victoria's manipulation became clear. She hadn't just faked Sarah's death. She had convinced Sarah that her own family had rejected her, that her son was better off without her. We have to find her, Richard said, his voice filled with a determination Maria had never heard before. We have to find Sarah and bring her home. Catherine stood, already reaching for her phone. I'm calling every private investigator in the city. If Sarah is alive, if she's been visiting this garden, then she's somewhere in Los Angeles. We're going to find her. As the adults began planning their search, Maria noticed that Jacob had returned to his drawing. But this time, he was adding something new, another figure in the garden. This one clearly meant to be himself in his wheelchair, reaching toward the distant woman with his arms outstretched. She's coming home, he said softly, not looking up from his work. I can feel it. Mom's coming home. Maria knelt beside him, her heart breaking and healing at the same time. For the first time since she had started working for the Blackwell family, she allowed herself to believe that this story might have a happy ending. But first, they had to find a woman who had been hidden away for 3 years, convince her that she was wanted, and reunite a family that had been torn apart by lies. The late afternoon sun slanted through the study windows, casting long shadows that seemed to point toward hope. Somewhere in Los Angeles, Sarah Blackwell was alive and waiting. And nothing, not Victoria's threats, not legal complications, not years of carefully constructed lies, was going to keep this family apart any longer. The real battle was just beginning. But for the first time, Maria believed they could win. The search for Sarah consumed the next several days with an intensity that transformed the entire household. The mansion that had once felt like a gilded prison now buzzed with purposeful activity. Richard had hired 3 different private investigation firms, each approaching the search from a different angle: financial records, social services databases, and street-level reconnaissance. Catherine had taken over coordinating the efforts, turning Richard's study into a command center filled with maps, photographs, and timeline charts. Maria found herself caught between 2 worlds, maintaining the facade of normalcy for Jacob while participating in the frantic search for his mother. The boy seemed to sense that something monumental was happening, but the adults had agreed to shield him from the details until they had concrete answers. Still, Jacob's excitement was palpable. His drawings had taken on a new vibrancy, filled with scenes of reunion and hope that made Maria's chest tight with emotion. Any word from Detective Morrison about Victoria? Catherine asked on Friday evening as she, Richard and Maria reviewed the day's findings. The detective had been keeping them informed about Victoria's situation. She was currently out on bail, staying with her sister in Beverly Hills while facing charges of filing a false police report and evidence tampering. Her lawyer is pushing for a plea deal, Richard replied, his voice carrying a weariness that spoke to sleepless nights and crushing guilt. But Morrison says the charges might escalate if we can prove she's been involved in more serious crimes. Maria looked up from the stack of missing person reports she'd been reviewing. Mr. Blackwell, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have mentioned earlier. Both Richard and Catherine turned their attention to her, and Maria felt the familiar flutter of nerves that came with speaking truth to power. But she had learned over the past weeks that some truths were too important to keep buried. About 6 months ago, I was cleaning Victoria's office when I found some papers. Financial documents that didn't make sense to me at the time, but now... Maria paused, choosing her words carefully. There were regular payments to something called Riverside Care Facility. Monthly payments of $3,000, going back almost 3 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face had gone completely white, while Catherine leaned forward with laser-focused intensity. Riverside Care, Catherine repeated slowly. That's a psychiatric facility in Pasadena. Richard, what if Victoria had Sarah committed? Richard finished, his voice barely a whisper. What if she convinced doctors that Sarah was mentally unstable, dangerous to herself or to Jacob? The implications were staggering. Maria watched the siblings process the possibility that Victoria's deception had been even more elaborate and cruel than they had imagined. Not content with simply separating Sarah from her family, she had potentially imprisoned her in a mental health facility under false pretenses. We need to call Riverside immediately, Catherine said, already reaching for her phone. Wait, Richard held up a hand. If Sarah is there, if she's been there for 3 years believing that we abandoned her, we can't just show up. We need to be careful, gentle. We need to understand what she's been told, what she believes about us. Maria thought of Jacob's drawings, of his dreams about his mother crying and apologizing. How many nights had Sarah lain awake in that facility, wondering why her husband and son had never come for her? The call to Riverside Care Facility was both heartbreaking and illuminating. After navigating privacy laws and patient confidentiality rules, they learned that a Sarah Martinez had been a patient there for 2 years and 11 months. She had been admitted following what was described as a severe psychological break after the traumatic loss of her family in a car accident. Martinez was her maiden name, Richard said after hanging up the phone. They said she refuses to use the name Blackwell, insists her husband and son are dead. Catherine was already gathering her coat. We're going there, tonight. The drive to Pasadena took 40 minutes through Los Angeles traffic, but it felt like hours. Maria sat in the back seat of Richard's Mercedes, watching the city lights blur past while her mind raced with questions. What would Sarah look like after 3 years in a psychiatric facility? Would she recognize Richard? Would she believe that Jacob was alive and searching for her? Riverside Care Facility was a sprawling complex of low buildings surrounded by manicured gardens. It looked more like a university campus than a mental health institution, but Maria could see the subtle security measures, discreet cameras, card access doors, staff members who carried themselves with the alert posture of people trained to handle emergencies. Dr. Jennifer Hoffman, Sarah's psychiatrist, met them in a small conference room near the main entrance. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, wearing the sort of comfortable clothing that suggested someone who prioritized substance over style. I have to admit, Mr. Blackwell, when you called tonight, I was skeptical, Dr. Hoffman said, settling into her chair. Sarah has been with us for nearly 3 years. And in all that time, no one has visited her or inquired about her condition. She's been convinced that her family died in the same accident that supposedly killed her. Supposedly. Richard leaned forward. Doctor, are you saying that Sarah wasn't in an accident? Dr. Hoffman consulted her file. Sarah was brought here by a woman who claimed to be her sister-in-law, along with legal documents stating that Sarah had suffered a complete psychological break following the traumatic loss of her family. She was catatonic when she arrived, barely responsive. It took months of therapy before she could even speak coherently. Victoria, Catherine said, her voice filled with disgusted understanding. "She brought Sarah here and convinced the doctors that her family was dead." "The documentation seemed legitimate at the time," Dr. Hoffman continued. "Death certificates, insurance claims, even newspaper clippings about the accident. But now that you're here, now that you're telling me this child Jacob is alive," she shook her head, "I need to understand exactly what happened." For the next hour, Richard and Catherine explained the entire situation: Victoria's deception, the faked death certificates, Jacob's drawings, the bracelet found in the garden. Dr. Hoffman listened with growing astonishment and anger. "This is one of the most elaborate cases of psychological manipulation I've ever encountered," she said finally. "Sarah has spent 3 years believing that her son is dead, that her husband moved on without her. The trauma of that belief has been the foundation of all her treatment." "How is she now?" Maria asked quietly. "I mean emotionally, psychologically?" Dr. Hoffman smiled for the first time since they had arrived. "Actually, Sarah has made remarkable progress in the past year. She's been participating in art therapy, has even started teaching drawing classes to other patients. She's mentioned several times that art helps her feel connected to her son's memory." The irony was heartbreaking. While Jacob had been developing his artistic talents as a way to cope with his mother's absence, Sarah had been using art to maintain her connection to the son she believed was dead. "Can we see her?" Richard asked, his voice thick with emotion. Dr. Hoffman hesitated. "Mr. Blackwell, I need you to understand that this revelation is going to be traumatic for Sarah. Learning that everything she's believed for 3 years was a lie, that her son is alive and has been searching for her. It's going to require very careful handling." "What do you recommend?" Catherine asked. "I'd like to prepare her gradually. Perhaps start by showing her some of Jacob's recent drawings. Let her process the possibility that he's alive before we bring them face to face." They agreed to Dr. Hoffman's approach, though Maria could see that every moment of delay was agony for Richard. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Hoffman made one final observation that stopped them all in their tracks. "Mr. Blackwell, there's something else you should know. For the past few months, Sarah has been asking about getting day passes to visit Los Angeles. She said she feels drawn to return to places that remind her of her old life. I've been reluctant to approve these requests because I was concerned about her emotional stability." "She's been visiting the garden," Maria realized. "She's been trying to get back to Jacob. It seems that way," Dr. Hoffman agreed. "Despite everything she's been told, despite all the evidence that her family was gone, some part of her never stopped hoping." As they drove back to Westwood, the car was filled with a mixture of hope and heartbreak. Tomorrow, they would begin the delicate process of reuniting a mother with the son she had never stopped loving, even when she believed he was dead. But first, they had to figure out how to tell Jacob that his dreams had been real all along, that his mother was alive, had been fighting to get back to him, and that they were about to have the reunion he had been drawing in pictures for 3 years. The mansion looked different as they pulled into the circular driveway. What had once seemed like an opulent prison now felt like a home, preparing to welcome back its missing piece. Jacob was asleep, but Maria could see his latest drawing still spread across his desk through his bedroom window. Another scene of reunion, another expression of hope that was about to become reality. Tomorrow would bring challenges none of them could fully anticipate. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, the Blackwell family had reason to believe in happy endings. The reunion between Sarah and Jacob was scheduled for the following afternoon at Riverside Care Facility, under Dr. Hoffman's careful supervision. But as Richard, Catherine, and Maria prepared for what should have been a joyful moment, they received news that cast a dark shadow over their plans. Victoria's attorney had filed an emergency motion for custody of Jacob, claiming that Richard was an unfit father who had allowed unstable individuals access to his disabled son. "She's using Sarah's psychiatric hospitalization against us," Richard said, his voice tight with anger as he reviewed the legal documents in his study. Victoria's claiming that reuniting Jacob with a mother who's been in mental health treatment would be detrimental to his well-being. Catherine looked up from her own copy of the papers, her face grim. She's also claiming that Maria has been conducting unauthorized therapy sessions with Jacob, and that you've created an emotionally unstable environment by encouraging his fantasies about his mother being alive. Maria felt her stomach drop. Mr. Blackwell, I was just being kind to him. I never claimed to be a therapist. We know that, Richard said quickly. But Victoria's lawyer is twisting everything. They're painting our entire household as chaotic and potentially harmful to Jacob's development. The irony was breathtaking. The woman who had systematically emotionally abused Jacob for years was now positioning herself as his protector. But Maria had learned enough about the legal system to know that truth and justice didn't always align, especially when significant wealth and influential lawyers were involved. "What does this mean for seeing Sarah today?" Catherine asked. Richard's phone rang before he could answer. His conversation was brief but intense, filled with legal terminology that Maria only partially understood. When he hung up, his expression was thunderous. "The family court has issued a temporary restraining order," he said. "Until the custody hearing next week, Jacob cannot have contact with Sarah. They're claiming it could be psychologically damaging to expose him to someone who's been institutionalized." The cruelty of it was staggering. After 3 years of separation based on lies, mother and son were being kept apart by the very woman who had orchestrated their original separation. Victoria had found a way to weaponize the legal system against them. "There has to be something we can do," Maria said, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. "She can't be allowed to manipulate the courts the way she manipulated everything else." Catherine looked at her with new respect. "Maria's right. We need to fight this, but we need to do it smart. Victoria's counting on us to react emotionally, to make mistakes that she can use against us." Over the next several hours, they developed a strategy. Richard's attorney would challenge the custody motion while simultaneously working to expose Victoria's financial fraud and the falsified documents surrounding Sarah's supposed death. Catherine would coordinate with Dr. Hoffman to document Sarah's mental health progress and her fitness to resume her role as Jacob's mother. "And Maria, I want to testify," Maria said during one of their planning sessions. "I've been in this house for 2 years. I've seen how Victoria treats Jacob, how she's systematically tried to destroy his self-worth. If this goes to court, I want to tell the truth about what I've witnessed." Richard looked at her with something approaching awe. "Maria, you understand what you're volunteering for? Victoria's lawyers will try to destroy your credibility. They'll dig into your background, question your motives, suggest that you're lying to protect your job. Let them try," Maria said, thinking of Jacob's drawings, of the quiet dignity with which he endured daily cruelty. "That little boy deserves to have someone speak for him, someone who's actually been paying attention to his life." The custody hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. In the days leading up to it, the Blackwell mansion became a hive of activity as lawyers, investigators, and expert witnesses prepared their case. Sarah, meanwhile, remained at Riverside Care, working with Dr. Hoffman to process the stunning revelation that her son was alive and fighting to see her. "She's handling it better than I expected," Dr. Hoffman reported during one of their daily check-ins. "The initial shock was significant, but Sarah's fundamental mental health is quite strong. Learning that Jacob is alive has actually energized her in a way I haven't seen since she arrived here." The night before the hearing, Maria found herself in Jacob's room, helping him with his evening routine. The boy had been told that there would be important legal meetings about his future, but the adults had agreed to shield him from the details until they knew the outcome. "Maria," Jacob said, as she helped him transfer from his wheelchair to his bed, "I had another dream about Mom last night." "What happened in the dream?" Maria asked, settling into the chair beside his bed. She was waiting for me in the garden, but there was a big wall between us. I kept calling to her and she kept calling back, but we couldn't reach each other. Jacob's blue eyes were thoughtful in the dim light of his bedroom. Do you think dreams mean something? Maria thought about the custody battle that would unfold tomorrow. About Victoria's lawyers trying to keep mother and son separated by legal walls, just as impenetrable as the one in Jacob's dream. I think dreams sometimes tell us about things our hearts already know, she said carefully. And I think your heart knows that people who love you are fighting very hard to be with you. Jacob nodded solemnly. Victoria doesn't love me, does she? She just pretends because of Dad. The question hit Maria like a physical blow. In all her months of documenting Victoria's cruelty, she had hoped that Jacob didn't fully understand the dynamic. But children see more than adults give them credit for. Some people have a hard time showing love, sweetheart. That doesn't mean you're not lovable. But you love me, Jacob said with the matter-of-fact tone that children use for fundamental truths. And Dad loves me. And I think Mom loves me too, even though I can't remember her very well. We all love you very much, Maria confirmed, her voice thick with emotion. And tomorrow, some very important people are going to make decisions about your future. But no matter what happens, you're going to be surrounded by people who care about you. As she tucked him in and turned off the lights, Maria found herself thinking about how much had changed since that morning, 3 weeks earlier, when she had first stood up to Victoria. What had started as a simple act of protecting a child from breakfast being withheld had evolved into a battle for the very soul of this family. Tomorrow, in a sterile courtroom filled with lawyers and judges, the truth would finally have its day. Victoria's web of lies and manipulation would be exposed, and Jacob would hopefully be reunited with the mother who had never stopped fighting to get back to him. But first, they had to win. And Maria knew that victory was far from guaranteed. Victoria had money, connections, and a legal team willing to say anything to protect their client. All they had was the truth, and the hope that sometimes that was enough. The mansion settled into quiet for the night, but Maria lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the little boy sleeping down the hall. Tomorrow would determine whether Jacob's dreams of reunion would become reality, or whether Victoria's final manipulation would succeed in keeping a family apart forever. In a few hours, the real battle would begin. The Los Angeles County Family Court building rose like a concrete monument to bureaucratic justice, its bland exterior offering no hint of the life-changing decisions made within its walls daily. Maria sat in the hallway outside courtroom 14, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the steady stream of lawyers, social workers, and families whose lives hung in the balance of judicial decisions. She wore her best dress, a simple navy blue outfit she had bought for her father's funeral 3 years earlier, and tried to project a confidence she didn't feel. Richard paced nearby, his usual business composure replaced by the raw anxiety of a father fighting for his child. Catherine sat quietly reviewing notes, her legal background making her an invaluable strategist, even though she couldn't officially represent them. Across the hallway, Victoria held court with her legal team, 3 expensive attorneys in tailored suits who exuded the kind of confidence that money could buy. "Sarah should be here," Richard muttered for the 10th time that morning. "This is about reuniting a family, and half the family can't even be present." "Dr. Hoffman's testimony will have to suffice for now," Catherine replied, though Maria could hear the frustration in her voice. "Once we expose Victoria's lies, the court will allow Sarah to participate in future proceedings." The bailiff appeared in the doorway. "Blackwell versus Blackwell, custody hearing for Jacob Blackwell. All parties to courtroom 14. The courtroom was smaller than Maria had expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a slightly greenish cast. Judge Patricia Hernandez was a woman in her early 60s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that suggested she had little patience for games or manipulation. She reviewed the case file with methodical precision before looking up at the assembled lawyers. "This is an emergency custody hearing regarding 7-year-old Jacob Blackwell," Judge Hernandez began. "Mrs. Victoria Blackwell is seeking temporary custody, claiming that the child's current living situation poses a risk to his emotional and psychological well-being. Mr. Richard Blackwell is contesting this petition. Councillor Martinez, you may present your opening statement." Victoria's lead attorney was a polished woman named Elena Martinez, who stood with the fluid grace of someone comfortable wielding power. "Your Honor, this case is about protecting a vulnerable child from adults who have prioritized their own emotional needs over his stability and safety." For the next 20 minutes, Martinez painted a picture of Richard as a neglectful father who had allowed unqualified personnel to provide psychological support to his disabled son. She portrayed Maria as an employee who had overstepped her boundaries and encouraged Jacob's delusional fantasies about his deceased mother. Most damaging of all, she presented Sarah as a mentally unstable woman whose reappearance would traumatize a child who had finally begun to heal from the loss of his mother. "Mr. Jacob Blackwell has endured tremendous trauma in his short life," Martinez concluded. "The loss of his mother, the accident that left him wheelchair-bound, and now the disruption of adults who claim to care about him but are actually destabilizing the only security he has known. Mrs. Victoria Blackwell has provided consistent care and stability for this child for 3 years. She represents continuity and safety in a world that has already given this little boy too much chaos." Maria felt sick listening to the lies, but she forced herself to remain calm. Victoria's strategy was clear: paint herself as the stable caregiver and everyone else as threats to Jacob's well-being. It was a masterful manipulation of facts that contained just enough truth to be believable. Richard's attorney, David Chen, stood to present their case. Chen was younger than Martinez, but had a reputation for thoroughness and integrity that had impressed Richard during their preparation. "Your Honor, this case is indeed about protecting a child," Chen began, "but it's about protecting him from a woman who has systematically abused him emotionally while his father was unaware of her actions. It's about reuniting a family that was torn apart by elaborate lies and manipulation." Chen methodically presented their evidence: the security footage showing Victoria's cruelty to Jacob, the falsified documents surrounding Sarah's supposed death, and the financial records proving Victoria's payments to Riverside Care Facility. He called Dr. Hoffman via video conference to testify about Sarah's mental state and her fitness to resume her parental role. Sarah Martinez, who prefers her maiden name because she believes her husband and son are dead, has made remarkable progress in her recovery, Dr. Hoffman testified. Her initial trauma was not caused by mental illness, but by being told that her family had died. Learning that her son is alive has actually accelerated her healing process. Then it was Maria's turn to testify. She approached the witness stand with her heart pounding, acutely aware that Victoria's eyes were boring into her with undisguised hatred. "Ms. Gonzalez," Chen began gently, "how long have you worked for the Blackwell family?" 2 years, sir. Since August of 2022. In that time, what have you observed about Jacob's relationship with Mrs. Victoria Blackwell? Maria took a deep breath and began to recount the incidents she had witnessed. The denied meals, the cruel words, the systematic undermining of Jacob's self-worth. She spoke about finding his heartbreaking drawings and the resignation in his voice when he accepted Victoria's treatment as normal. "Ms. Gonzalez," Martinez interrupted during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you were facing termination for theft when you decided to make these accusations against Mrs. Blackwell?" I was falsely accused of theft, Maria replied steadily. The security footage proves that Mrs. Blackwell planted the bracelet in my room. Allegedly, Martinez shot back. Isn't it convenient that these supposed security cameras only came to light after you needed to defend yourself against criminal charges? Maria felt the weight of the courtroom's attention, but she thought of Jacob's drawings, of his quiet dignity in the face of daily cruelty, and found her voice. Your Honor, I'm the daughter of a seamstress from Amarillo, Texas. I need this job to support my sick mother. The last thing I would ever do is jeopardize my employment by making false accusations against my employer. But that little boy deserved to have someone speak for him, someone who actually saw how he was being treated when the cameras weren't rolling and his father wasn't home. The sincerity in her voice seemed to resonate with Judge Hernandez, who made a note and nodded for Chen to continue. The most dramatic moment came when Chen called Richard to testify about discovering the truth. Richard's voice broke as he described watching the security footage of Victoria's cruelty, finding the falsified death certificate, and realizing that his son had been suffering while he remained obliviously focused on his business. Mr. Blackwell, Martinez asked during cross-examination, if you were truly concerned about your son's well-being, why did you leave him alone with Mrs. Blackwell for extended periods? Why did it take a housekeeper to alert you to problems in your own home? Richard's answer was devastating in its honesty. Because I was a coward. Because facing the truth about my wife meant acknowledging that I had failed my son. Because it was easier to trust that Victoria was caring for Jacob than to confront the possibility that I had brought another person into his life who could hurt him. Judge Hernandez called a recess to review the evidence. During the break, Maria noticed Jacob for the first time. Richard had brought him to court so the judge could speak with him privately if needed. He sat in his wheelchair in the hallway, drawing in his sketchbook with the focused concentration she knew so well. What are you drawing, sweetheart? She asked, kneeling beside him. Jacob looked up with eyes that seemed far older than his 7 years. It's our family, he said, turning the sketchbook toward her. Look, there's Dad and you and Aunt Catherine. And there's Mom, waiting for us to bring her home. The drawing showed 4 figures standing together, with a 5th figure in the distance, arms outstretched toward them. It was a picture of hope, of family, of the reunion they were all fighting for. Jacob, Maria said softly, no matter what happens in there, you're going to be surrounded by people who love you. Do you understand that? And Jacob nodded solemnly. Victoria doesn't love me, but that's okay because I have all of you. When court reconvened, Judge Hernandez's expression was unreadable. She had spent the recess reviewing evidence, checking legal precedents, and undoubtedly grappling with a case that challenged every assumption about family, truth, and justice. This court has reviewed extensive evidence regarding the well-being of Jacob Blackwell, she began. The evidence clearly shows that Mrs. Victoria Blackwell engaged in systematic emotional abuse of this child and committed fraud by falsifying documents related to his biological mother's death. Victoria's face went white, but Judge Hernandez wasn't finished. However, this court's primary concern is the immediate welfare of Jacob Blackwell. Given the extraordinary circumstances of this case, including the need to carefully reintroduce him to a mother he believed was dead, I am ordering the following. Maria held her breath as the judge outlined her decision. Temporary custody would remain with Richard, with supervised visitation rights for Sarah beginning immediately. Victoria's visitation rights were suspended, pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. Most importantly, the court was ordering a comprehensive family reunification plan, overseen by child psychologists and social workers. Furthermore, Judge Hernandez concluded, I want to commend Ms. Maria Gonzalez for her courage in advocating for this child's welfare. It's clear that her intervention prevented continued harm and ultimately led to the truth being exposed. As the gavel fell, Maria felt tears of relief streaming down her face. They had won, not just the legal battle, but the war for Jacob's future. Across the courtroom, Victoria sat frozen in her chair, the reality of her defeat finally sinking in, but the real victory would come later, when they could finally bring Sarah home and complete the family that Victoria had tried so hard to destroy. For now, it was enough to know that Jacob would never again have to endure cruelty and silence, and that sometimes, just sometimes, standing up for what's right could change everything. 6 months after the court's decision, the former Blackwell mansion had been transformed into something Maria never could have imagined when she first pushed her cleaning cart through its marble hallways. The grand foyer now served as a welcoming reception area for the Blackwell Family Center for Special Needs Children, its crystal chandeliers casting warm light over comfortable seating areas where families gathered for support and resources. The formal dining room had become a bright classroom space, filled with adaptive technology and art supplies, while the mansion's numerous bedrooms had been converted into therapy rooms and offices for the growing team of specialists. Maria stood in what had once been Victoria's opulent master suite, now her own office as the center's educational director. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the garden where Jacob had first spotted his mother 6 months earlier. The roses were blooming again, tended now by Sarah's gentle hands as part of her horticultural therapy program. It seemed fitting that the space where so much pain had been hidden was now a place of healing and growth. Maria. A gentle knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Jennifer Hoffman entered, carrying a stack of progress reports and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose professional life had taken an unexpectedly fulfilling turn. When the center opened, Dr. Hoffman had agreed to leave Riverside Care to become their lead therapist, bringing with her decades of experience in trauma recovery and family reunification. How did the evaluations go this week? Maria asked, setting aside the grant proposal she had been reviewing. The center's funding came from a combination of Richard's personal investment, insurance reimbursements, and grants that Maria had become surprisingly adept at writing. Her night school classes in special education had evolved into a master's degree program, with Richard covering her tuition as part of her professional development package. Better than we could have hoped, Dr. Hoffman replied, settling into one of the comfortable chairs that had replaced Victoria's formal furniture. The Morrison family is making excellent progress with their daughter's communication therapy, and that new art therapy program that Jacob suggested. It's showing remarkable results with children who've experienced trauma. The mention of Jacob's input made Maria smile. At 8 years old, he'd become an unofficial consultant for the center, offering insights from his unique perspective as both a client and a child who understood what other disabled kids needed to thrive. His artistic talent had blossomed under professional guidance, and several of his pieces now hung in the center's hallways, not as inspiration porn, but as genuine artistic achievements that spoke to resilience and hope. Speaking of Jacob, Dr. Hoffman continued, Sarah wanted me to give you this. She handed Maria a small wrapped package that felt like a book. Inside, Maria found a leather-bound journal with "For Maria, who saved our family," inscribed on the cover in Sarah's elegant handwriting. The reunion between Sarah and Jacob had been carefully orchestrated over several weeks, beginning with supervised visits and gradually increasing in duration and intimacy. Maria would never forget the moment when mother and son were finally alone together. For the first time in 3 years, she had watched through a two-way window as Jacob rolled his wheelchair directly to Sarah and simply said, "Mom, I knew you'd come back." Sarah's tears and Jacob's quiet acceptance had marked the beginning of a healing process that was still ongoing. "How is Sarah adjusting to everything?" Maria asked, running her fingers over the journal's soft leather cover. "Remarkably well. The trauma of believing her family was dead was significant, but Sarah's fundamental resilience is extraordinary. Her relationship with Jacob is becoming stronger every day, and she's found real purpose in helping other families navigate similar challenges. Through the window, Maria could see Sarah and Jacob working together in the garden, their dark heads bent over a new planting project. Sarah's recovery had been aided by learning that Jacob shared her love of both art and growing things. Had created a memory garden together, with plants representing different stages of their separation and reunion, a living timeline of healing. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced Richard's arrival. He appeared in the doorway wearing jeans and a casual shirt, a stark contrast to the business suits that had once defined him. The real estate empire had been significantly downsized after the divorce settlement and legal costs, but Richard seemed genuinely happier, focusing on accessible housing development and the center's operations. The new family orientation went well, he reported, settling into the chair across from Maria's desk. The Johnsons are eager to start their son in the program next week. And Maria, I wanted to thank you again for handling the state inspection so smoothly. The transformation in Richard's relationship with his son had been perhaps the most dramatic change of all. No longer the distant businessman who delegated parenting to others, he had become intensely involved in Jacob's daily life and education. Father and son now shared breakfast every morning, worked on homework together, and had established a weekly tradition of exploring Los Angeles's accessible attractions. "Any word from Detective Morrison about Victoria's sentencing?" Dr. Hoffman asked. Richard's expression darkened slightly. 2 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole in 18 months. Her lawyers managed to plea down most of the charges, but the financial fraud convictions stuck. She'll also be required to pay restitution to Riverside Care and to Sarah for the emotional damages. Victoria's trial had been a media sensation, with Los Angeles reporters fascinated by the story of wealth, deception, and ultimate justice. Maria had testified again, this time in criminal court, where Victoria's defense team had been less successful in painting her as an unreliable witness. The security footage and financial records had provided irrefutable evidence of Victoria's systematic deception. "Part of me feels sorry for her," Maria admitted. She must have been so afraid of losing her comfortable life that she was willing to destroy other people to protect it. "That's what makes you special, Maria," Richard said with the kind of respect that still surprised her. "You can find empathy even for someone who tried to destroy your life." The afternoon was interrupted by the sound of children's laughter echoing through the hallways. The center now served 43 families from across Los Angeles County, providing everything from occupational therapy to educational support to family counseling. What had started as a desperate attempt to save one family had evolved into a comprehensive resource for families facing similar challenges. "I should check on the art therapy session," Maria said, standing and smoothing her professional dress, a far cry from the navy uniform she had worn as a housekeeper. But she still preferred practical clothing that allowed her to get down on the floor with children when needed. The art therapy room was filled with the concentrated energy of children absorbed in creative expression. Jacob sat at a table with 3 other kids, helping a younger boy with cerebral palsy adapt his grip on a paintbrush. His patience and encouragement reminded Maria of the quiet dignity he had shown, even in his darkest moments with Victoria. "Ms. Maria," called out Emma, a 6-year-old with spina bifida who had become one of Jacob's closest friends. "Look what I painted." The canvas showed a family of stick figures holding hands, with wheels drawn carefully under one of the smaller figures. It was the kind of representation that Maria had learned to celebrate. Not inspiration or tragedy, but simply childhood art that happened to include disability as a normal part of life. "That's beautiful, Emma," Maria said, kneeling beside the little girl's wheelchair. "Tell me about your painting." As Emma chattered excitedly about her artwork, Maria caught Jacob's eye across the room. He smiled, the genuine, unreserved smile that had become his signature since his mother's return, and gave her a small thumbs up. In that moment, Maria realized that this was what victory looked like. Not dramatic courtroom scenes or newspaper headlines, but quiet moments of children feeling safe enough to express themselves, families finding support in their darkest hours, and communities forming around shared understanding rather than shared suffering. That evening, as the center's activities wound down, Maria found herself in the garden with Sarah and Jacob. They were watering the new plantings in the memory garden, each plant carefully chosen to represent different aspects of their journey. "Maria," Sarah said softly, "I've been thinking about how to thank you for everything you've done for our family." "You don't need to," Maria began, but Sarah held up a hand. "Yes, I do. Not just for standing up to Victoria, but for seeing Jacob's worth when others couldn't. For believing that our family was worth fighting for when we couldn't fight for ourselves." Jacob looked up from the seedling he was tending. "Maria, will you always work here? Will you always be part of our family?" The question was asked with the earnest intensity that only children possess, and Maria felt her throat tighten with emotion. 2 years ago, she'd been invisible. A woman whose greatest ambition was simply to keep her job and support her mother's medical care. Now she was an integral part of a family's healing, a respected professional in her field, and an advocate for children who needed someone to see their potential rather than their limitations. "As long as you need me," she promised, meaning every word. As the sun set over Los Angeles, casting golden light across the garden that had once been a symbol of wealth and now represented hope, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Her mother's health had stabilized, the medical bills were finally manageable, and Carmen Gonzalez now spoke with proud amazement about her daughter who had saved a family and built something beautiful from the pieces. The center was thriving, expanding to include siblings, support groups, parent education programs, and advocacy training for families navigating complex medical and educational systems. Jacob's artwork had been featured in several galleries, with proceeds supporting the center's scholarship fund. Sarah had enrolled in counseling psychology classes, with plans to eventually provide peer support for other parents who had experienced family separation. And Richard had found a peace that wealth alone had never provided, the knowledge that his son was surrounded by love, that his family was whole, and that their story of pain had been transformed into a source of healing for others. As they walked back toward the mansion's warm lights, Jacob suddenly stopped his wheelchair and looked back at the garden. "What is it, sweetheart?" Sarah asked. "I was just thinking," Jacob said thoughtfully, "about how many families are going to find each other here. How many kids are going to learn that they're not broken, just different." Maria looked at this remarkable child who had endured so much and emerged with such wisdom, and realized that this was the true measure of their success. Not the legal victories or media attention, but the quiet confidence in Jacob's voice when he spoke about other children finding hope. The mansion that had once echoed with loneliness and cruelty now hummed with laughter, learning, and the daily miracle of families discovering that love was stronger than any challenge they might face. And at the center of it all was the understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing one person can do is simply refuse to look away when another person needs help. As they reached the front door, Maria turned for one last look at the garden, where a mother and son had found each other again. Tomorrow would bring new families, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that every child deserved to be seen, valued, and loved for exactly who they were. But tonight, it was enough to know that home could be rebuilt, that families could heal, and that courage, even when it started as small as refusing to let a child go hungry, could change the world in ways that rippled far beyond anything imaginable. And hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and if you watched until here, comment "I watched until here," and leave your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the end screen for you. It's very exciting.